Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of the new Samyang AF 35mm F1.8. This is the newest lens in their tiny series, as they call it, which I've really enjoyed, not only because of their compact size and weight, but also because I think there's been some really intriguing optics that have been a part of this series. And of course, having just reviewed the new Sony A7C, I look at lenses like the tiny series as being a really natural pairing for a camera like that for those of you that are wanting to travel small and light but you don't want to compromise on image quality. So today we're going to give you the definitive review of this compact lens and see whether or not it is worthy of your consideration and whether or not you should consider it as opposed to the Sony 35mm F1.8. Now today we are doing the definitive review, which means that we're going to look at everything in detail. If you prefer your reviews to be quicker and more to the point, then I recommend that you check out the standard review instead, and it has less of the nitty-gritty and more of the conclusions. But if you want all of the nitty-gritty, you're in the right spot. Let's jump in, let's take a look at the build and the handling, the feature set of this new little lens. So first thing I do want to point out is that while these Samyang tiny lenses are inexpensive, and relative to the market, they don't cheap out in terms of what you get with them. And so first of all, they all come with, nicely kind of molded cases that do offer nice protection value, and they're not so huge that, you won't ever use it. They also all come with a lens hood, which, you kind of take for granted these days, but then every now and then I'll review, say, a Canon lens that's not an L series lens and realize it doesn't come with a lens hood, and it's like, really? But anyway, so I do appreciate the fact that you're getting good bang for your buck in terms of those accessories. But even more importantly here, Samyang has continued to offer more and more features with the tiny series. And so as far as the the 35mm, or really starting with the 75mm, they added this custom switch. Previously, they were just a smooth barrel. The only thing on there was the focus ring. But what we've got now is we've got this custom switch that if you have the lens station, you can actually program what each mode is going to do. And so I'll demonstrate in just a moment on camera, but I've got mode 1 set up to where I have a manual aperture ring, which I personally really like. Not everyone does, but I'm able to use the focus ring for manual aperture. Then if I go into mode 2, it automatically switches to manual focus, and of course then I switch to the manual focus ring. So it's like having both an AF/MF switch and then also having the option of having an aperture ring, and so certainly an advantage there. What Samyang has added here is that they've also added not only a gasket at the lens mount, but there are 4 different seal points at the switch, at the ring, and then close to the front element. And so it actually all matches what's in the Sony FE 35mm F1.8, with the exception that the Sony lens does have just an AF/MF switch, but then it also has a focus hold button. So there's an additional seal point at that focus hold button. But in terms of what's here, we've actually got identical levels of sealing to what we have on the Sony lens. Now, in terms of the actual manual aperture ring, if you're in that mode, so if I switch to the manual aperture ring, what you find is that you have a fairly nicely damped, it's still focused by wire, but it does a good job, good precision. It also seems to be a linear focus ring in that even if I go at different speeds, I end up at the same, location, even if I come at it more slowly. And so that is nice for repeatability when it comes to focus pulls. And then of course, if I switch into custom 1, what you see is that I get a manual aperture control, and so I can control aperture from the lens itself. And so I'm really a fan of this setup because it does give you ability, and you can customize a few other features on there if you so desire. Also up front here, we have a 58mm front filter thread, which is, nice and common. You can focus down to 0.29 meters, 29 centimeters, which is right under a foot. And so there you have an okay 0.17 times magnification, not world beating and not as good as the Sony. The Sony has a 0.24 times magnification. Now, in terms of how the lens physically compares to the Sony, I've got it here on an A7R Mark III, and of course I've got a grip extender, and so in this setting the lens looks, really particularly small. But I also noted in my A7C review that it's a really nice pairing for a more compact camera like that, and of course being this small, it also mounts nicely on APS-C cameras, where it'll give you a 52.5mm angle of view, so essentially a normal angle of view, which obviously is going to be very useful there. In terms of our overall weight, it's only 210 grams for the lens. And so, the Sony lens is 281 grams, which is also, of course, very light in an absolute sense. But relatively, there is a significant difference in the weight if you're really counting the grams. So that's 7.4 ounces for the lens. The overall diameter of the lens is 65 millimeters, which is just a tiny bit smaller than the 65.5 millimeters for the Sony lens, but the length is significantly shorter. It's only 63 millimeters, 63 and a half millimeters in length compared to 73 millimeters for the Sony, and so, it is definitely more compact. Now inside you've got 9 rounded aperture blades, and so we can see even stop down significantly. We still have a round aperture. Here's a look at the various aperture settings, and so you can see that you get, even stop down a few stops. You still have, fairly round, aperture bokeh circles. Obviously the biggest difference here though between this lens and the Sony lens is going to be the fact that you can get this lens for $399 or 400 US dollars compared to 700 US dollars, and that's on sale. Normal price is closer to 750. And so that is probably going to be the single greatest deciding factor for a lot of people. So overall, of course, I really like what we have got here. I mean, obviously I like the fact of how compact it is, but I also, it's kind of interesting to me, when I first started reviewing these Samyang lenses for Sony, there's two things that I really kind of highlighted that I wanted to see happen. One is that I prefer to have an AF-MF switch on the side of the barrel. The other is that I wanted to see weather sealing. I'm really delighted that Samyang has responded to both of those requests and really taken it a bit further when it comes to the AF-MF switch. This custom switch gives me even a bit more. And so what I'm finding is that, traditionally, Samyang lenses have been able to compete optically, but not in the autofocus or in the feature set. So first of all, we're seeing that the feature set, the gap is starting to close to where you don't have to compromise nearly as much in terms of features or build compared to first-party lenses like you used to. What we're also going to find is the same applies when we look at the autofocus performance of this particular lens. Because just like Sony does, they're employing a linear focus motor here, and what I have found is that focus is basically near instantaneous. I can go from focusing on a close object to an infinity object with almost zero lag. It just jumps from one to the other with no sound, no drama. It just does the trick. We can also see if we check out focus pulls that same quiet performance is true there as well. Let's take a peek. So two things stand out. Number one, how quiet everything is, but also that we see that, particularly in that setting, I think that Samyang has really damped focus pulls for video performance to where there is a nice smooth transition from one point to another. Rather than like a jump back and forth, we see that there's a nice smooth transition, which I suspect that most people will prefer if they're making a significant focus pull during video performance. I also found that the IAF performance was very good from the lens. I did several portrait sessions, one of those just available light with my daughter, and as you can see, all of these shots are really well focused. It snapped right on to the eye, and I did some of that with the A7C. That particular series I shot with the A7C, and I had flawless results, everything perfectly focused. Now, in a secondary series, I was actually using strobes. I was doing shots with my family, which meant that it complicates things as I need to be in the frame, and I find those sessions to be the most technically challenging because I've got to basically deal with everything in advance, and I lose out on being able to be behind the camera and kind of mastering the camera. And so it is more of a challenge, and I was, further complicated because I was using triggers and multiple strobes. I've been testing the Godox 8300 Pro, which is a great flash, by the way. My review will come before too long. And but just a lot of moving parts. What I've found on a few occasions is when I have to remote trigger a camera, and in this case, because I wanted the resolution, I was using the A7R Mark III, which, while it's a great camera and it has a good focus system, out of my current cameras, it has the least of the focus system. And I found on a few occasions where I've been doing group shots that I needed to be in, that sometimes focus ended up some other spot than where I wanted. I was really delighted to find in this case, however, everything was focused perfectly from the Samyang AF 35mm, and also everything was very, very sharp. I liked the results that I got, and so positive on that front. So as far as autofocus goes, you know, I said this in the written review. I suspect that in an absolute sense, the Sony FE 35mm f1.8 is probably superior when it comes to autofocus, but I would be hard-pressed to tell you where. I have good accuracy, great speed, and very quiet performance. And so, I don't know that I have much to complain about on that front, and I suspect neither will you. So how about the image quality? We're going to jump in and take a look in detail at how this particular lens performs. Let's jump in, let's take a look. So we'll start off by taking a look at vignette and distortion. As you can see, there's a tiny bit of barrel distortion, not a whole lot to write home about, and you can see that there definitely is some vignette. You can see my manual corrections on the right side. Now it will be corrected in camera for JPEGs and or video. However, at this stage there isn't yet a profile in Lightroom, and so I'm having to correct it manually. Here's the corrections. I did a +3 to correct for the barrel distortion, and then a +53, which tells me somewhere between 2 and 3 stops in the corners, and then I slid the midpoint all the way over to give us a nice linear end result. As you can see, it all corrects up nicely, no big deal there. So if we take a look at the wide open performance, this is at a 200% magnification, which is the way I do these so you can see things nice and clearly. It's punishing, obviously. It's going to highlight flaws. That's kind of the point. What we can see wide open, however, is that we actually have a very good amount of resolution in the center of the frame and good but not exceptional contrast. If we move to our mid-frame end result, we can see that it's a little bit softer but still quite sharp, but you can definitely see the contrast is not amazing. If we look down into the corner, what we see is there's actually quite a lot of resolution there, but quite low contrast in the edge of the frame. Now, if we compare f1.8 to f2, first of all, you'll note that the actual shutter speed doesn't change in terms of metering. Part of that is because there is less vignette, and so you just get a little bit of a brighter end result. However, as we can also see here, there's not really anything significant that's changing in terms of our actual resolution here. Maybe a tiny bit more contrast, but not enough to, you know, be significant in any way. However, because you're not really losing any stop of light, there's also a little penalty for shooting at f2 to give you a little extra punch. Now, where the radical difference is between f1.8 and f2.8, where you can see we have a dramatic increase of contrast above all else, but some increased resolution that comes as a byproduct of that. So the center looks fantastic, the mid-frame looks very, very strong, and now our corner performance is excellent, very, very strong at f2.8. We can see that out in the real world as well. If we look in the center of the frame, both of them actually look quite excellent, f1.8 or f2.8. But as you move towards the edge of the frame, you can see that, you know, contrast and resolution just look a lot stronger. As we pan a little bit this direction, you can see that just the plane of sharpness is extending much further out and with higher contrast, and so a much better result stop down. Now we can see if we stop on down to f4, we increase contrast and sharpness even more to where it's really, really fantastic now. And maybe even a bit more at f5.6. You can just see that there's a little bit more punch, but clearly we've gotten really excellent results all across the frame at these aperture values. Great contrast, great resolution, a very, very strong optical performance. We can see even in that infinity shot that even though f2.8 looked fantastic before, f5.6 looks better still. Just really, really fabulous all across the frame. And so if you're shooting at smaller aperture values like f5.6, you're going to get really, really nice landscape results. Even on a 42 megapixel A7R Mark III, you can just see that the results across the frame are really excellent. Here's another real world example, and so you can see just as we look across this forest scene, there's just good detail everywhere that you look, lots of detail in the frame. A little bit of chromatic aberrations you can see in those high contrast areas, but nothing too major, but definitely up in the corner you're seeing some of the lateral chromatic aberration showing up in this particular frame. Not hard to correct for if you just click the remove chromatic aberrations and they clean up cleanly, but I did want to show you that. Here's a real-world result at f8, and so you can see that in the distance and all across the surface of the water, really great detail, and just all throughout the frame. This plane of focus doesn't extend all the way to the rocks here. You can see it starting to end somewhere along here, but even so, we've got a really nice end result from it there. Now here is our minimum focus distance, and it shows, which is right under a foot, 29 centimeters. And 0.17 times magnification. However, you can see that contrast isn't amazing wide open. You're going to need to stop down to about f2.8 to really get your kind of maximum result up close. Case in point is, while I actually love the shot, I love the color contrast and the kind of mood of it, if I go into a pixel level, it's okay, but it's not exceptional. And this is wide open f1.8, and that kind of illustrates the close-up focus point. Now we saw that there was some lateral chromatic aberration. What we can also see, which by the way you can see a bit of here, but we can also see that before the plane of focus there is only a tiny bit of magenta, but there is a little bit more pronounced kind of a green-blue fringing after the plane of focus, and that's what I see showing up more in the real world. Case in point is this shot here, and so at f1.8 you can see on this kind of lichen that's growing on there that there's only a tiny bit of purple fringing, no big deal, but you can definitely see that green fringing after the plane of focus. Stopping down to f2.8 virtually eliminates it all, and so you can see contrast takes a real boost at that point, which is what we saw in the chart test and real world results as well. You will also see that a little bit in bokeh highlights. You can see that kind of fringing around it. At the same time, also, though, it's pretty clean in the center of the frame. Geometry doesn't look too bad. We can see as we stop down that, geometry, this is now at f2.8. It's, starting to be circular everywhere that we look. And even if we, start to move towards the edge of the frame with f4 or f5.6, we can see a little bit of a nonagonal shape, but it's staying pretty circular. If I compose right off near the end of the frame, you can see that transition towards the squeeze at the edge, but it's not as extreme as what I've seen with some lenses. But still, you're going to want to stop down to around f2.8 if you want circular highlights across the frame. Now, real-world bokeh, can look really good. I like this image a lot. I like the way it kind of bleeds into focus. However, with an f1.8 lens and a 35mm focal length, you don't have as much potential for blurring out a background. Now in this situation, which also looks pretty good, but you can see it's a little bit busier, and it's going to depend on your ratio of your distance to your subject to your background, but you just have to kind of learn to work within the limits of a lens like this. So I think the bokeh is good, and I recommend you look at the image gallery for more photos to get a better sense, but there are limitations to it. Now in terms of flare resistance, wide open, I actually think that things look pretty decent. And so you can see that as we video pan across that, there is a little bit of a ghosting flare pattern, but it's not strongly pronounced. And we can see back to the still image that there's just a little bit of a prismatic haze coming off. Nothing too bad. Stopping down, we can see that contrast has continued to hold up here, but you can see that the ghosting pattern is slightly more pronounced, and that's true with the video pan here as well. You can just see that there is, a bit of prismatic haze and, ghosting pattern as we pan back and forth. Putting the sun near the edge of the frame, produces some interesting effects. I don't think a negative here. I actually kind of like the effect, but I just want to kind of show you what happens in various situations with the sun. So finally, if we take a look at coma performance, this wasn't under optimal conditions. It was actually morning, and so the sun was not far from setting, and also you can see that clouds were forming, but enough to give us a look here. At the center of the frame, stars look, good. There's a little bit of fringing, and you can see that the difference between f1.8 and f2 is not enough to really be significant. Now, if we move off to the edge of the frame where, chromatic distortion is more likely to show up, what I do see is a slight reduction at f2, and also the vignette is less heavy. And so I would recommend, again, you can see that there isn't really much of a difference in exposure. And so I would recommend shooting at f2 for shooting the night sky. You get a minor reduction of coma effect without any kind of real, downside or loss there. And so I think that's the aperture to go. Not the best performance I've seen, but a little bit better than what we saw on the Sony equivalent. So a few takeaways there. First of all, as you can see, this lens has good sharpness wide open. It has fantastic sharpness when it's stopped down a bit. It does have a little more chromatic aberration, a little bit more fringing than what I would necessarily like. But the upside of that is that while it does reduce contrast wide open, by f2.8, that CA is all cleared up and we have a fabulously sharp image. And so with very, very high contrast. And in fact, it's actually the sharper lens compared to the Sony. It is a little bit sharper wide open, particularly towards the edges of the frame, but it has the potential for greater sharpness when stopped down than what the Sony does. And so certainly pluses there. The one place where the Sony, I think, is advantaged beyond, controlling chromatic aberrations is the fact that it does give you a higher magnification, 0.24 times, very useful, but it's also a little bit better in performance at, wide open at close focus distances. And so, that's one aspect where I certainly prefer the Sony. At the end of the day, however, I think that the compelling factor for a lot of people is going to be the fact that you can pick up this Samyang lens for $400 US, while the Sony, even on sale at the moment that I'm looking at prices, is $700 and normally $750. And so what that tells me is that when, market forces or a sale drops the price a little bit on the Samyang, it's likely to be half the price of the Sony lens. And I think that that's obviously going to be a compelling factor for a lot of people when you consider that you're not really giving up much in terms of either features, autofocus, and optical performance. And so, that's certainly a compelling thing. I do want to also point out, because it is a point of often confusion, Samyang and Rokinon are the exact same lenses. There is some difference in branding in different markets. And so if you say, I don't see the Samyang, I see a Rokinon lens, it looks like what you're talking about, it's the same thing. So the final thing that I do want to put out for your consideration is that Samyang does have a 35mm f1.4 lens, and as far as the price goes, because the price of that lens has dropped, it's only currently retailing for $500 US compared to $400 for this. So, that may be compelling to some of you. I'm going to point out the reasons why I think that I would actually choose this lens. First of all, unless you dramatically need the f1.4 aperture, this lens is 3 times lighter, it is 2 times shorter. It also has, and I did own the f1.4 for a while, but I found that the autofocus performance was much more inconsistent than what I'm seeing here. And so it wasn't as good with IAF. It was also just less consistent in terms of focus accuracy. And this lens has been extremely reliable for me, and that lens really wasn't. And so if I were spending the money, even though it's tempting to go for the larger, pro-grade f1.4 aperture, and there are some things that are really great about that lens, I personally would go for this one. I love the form factor. I think its performance is right up there with the Sony, and so I think it's well worthy of your consideration. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you'll look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review, also to an image gallery. There are buying links there as well if you'd like to purchase one. There's also linkage there to follow me on social media, to become a patron, to sign up for my new newsletter that goes out every week. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.